The houses that built and broke the king of pop. He rewrote the rules of global entertainment, sold hundreds of millions of records, and became arguably the most recognized face on the planet. But before any of that, there was a two-bedroom house on a quiet street in a struggling steel town, and almost nobody outside that neighborhood knew his name. What if I told you that the walls of that tiny house still stand today, and that urban explorers have spent years trying to piece together what really happened inside it? Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll understand how a handful of addresses, some crumbling, some hidden behind fortress-like security, trace the entire arc of Michael Jackson's life, from obscurity to a level of fame no performer has matched since. Gary, Indiana, where it all began. Gary, Indiana was once a booming steel town, built almost entirely around U.S. steel and the industrial wealth that came with it. By the time the Jackson family was raising 9 children there in the 1960s, the city's fortunes were already starting to slip. But inside 2300 Jackson Street, something else was being built entirely. The house itself is barely 672 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 11 people. If you've ever felt like your apartment was too small for your family, imagine fitting 11 people into a space many single professionals today would consider cramped for one. There was no room for privacy, and there was definitely no room for boredom. That's exactly the environment Joe Jackson used to his advantage. The living room doubled as a rehearsal space, and by most accounts, rehearsals were not gentle. Discipline, repetition, and relentless practice turned a house with almost no square footage into what many historians now describe as one of the most productive artist incubators of the 20th century. Ask yourself this: how many legendary careers have started not in a state-of-the-art studio, but in a living room too small to hold a couch and an audience at the same time? Today, the home has been preserved as a historic site, complete with a small stone tribute statue for visitors and fans who make the pilgrimage to Gary, specifically to see where it all started. It stands in stark contrast to a city that has lost much of its population and industry since, a modest wooden structure surrounded by the visible effects of economic decline, yet still drawing pilgrims from across the globe. There's also been online chatter around a separate site, an abandoned property filled with old dolls, aged furniture, and toys that look untouched for decades, which some claim is connected to Michael's early life. Unlike the Jackson Street home, this location has never been officially verified, and its true connection to the family remains murky at best. Is it a genuine piece of forgotten history, or an urban legend that picked up steam online? That's still up for debate. What do you think? The hospital where a legend was born. On August 29, 1958, Michael Jackson entered the world at St. Mary's Mercy Hospital in Gary, a hospital that, at the time, served a booming industrial workforce and their families. As Gary's population and economy contracted over the following decades, the hospital's finances collapsed right along with it, and the building was eventually abandoned altogether. Since then, the empty hospital has become something of a magnet for urban explorers, several of whom claim to have located Room 207, allegedly the very room where Jackson was born. Whether that specific claim holds up is hard to verify given the building's advanced decay, but the site continues to draw fans hoping to connect, even briefly, with the very beginning of his story. It's a strange kind of pilgrimage, walking through crumbling hallways in search of the first room a future icon ever occupied. First stages, first paychecks. Just a short distance away sits Garnett Elementary School, where a 6-year-old Michael took his very first steps onto a stage during a school talent show. The building today is in ruins, but remnants, old chalkboards, scattered supplies, still hint at the ordinary classroom where an extraordinary performer first tested his voice in front of an audience. Not far from there was Mr. Lucky's Lounge, a modest neighborhood venue where the Jackson 5 played their first ever paid performance. Michael couldn't have been older than 7 or 8 at the time. The building has all but collapsed now, a caved-in roof, rotted floorboards. But for a moment, standing inside what's left of it, it's genuinely eerie to think that this crumbling shell once echoed with a crowd's applause for 5 kids who had no idea what they were about to become. Steeltown Records, the first real studio. Long before Motown entered the picture, there was Steeltown Records, a small independent label founded in Gary in 1966 by Gordon Keith. This is where the Jackson 5 recorded their very first single, Big Boy, in 1968. It wasn't a polished radio-ready hit. It was raw, youthful, and a little rough around the edges, but it was proof of concept, and it was enough to get bigger industry players paying attention. The physical building has since been demolished, but its role in music history hasn't been forgotten. Steeltown represents that critical, often overlooked stage between talented local kids and signed professional recording artists. The stage most success stories skip over when they get retold, but the stage where the real groundwork actually happens. Gary hasn't let that legacy fade quietly either. A large mural of the Jackson 5 on Broadway Street, repainted in 2025 by artist Felix Flex Maldonado Jr. after earlier versions were lost to demolition, keeps that memory visible on a public wall for anyone driving through the city today. From Motown to the Mansion. In 1969, the Jackson 5 signed with Motown Records, and that's really where the machinery of global stardom kicked into gear. Under Berry Gordy's guidance, the brothers relocated to Los Angeles and were thrown headfirst into professional choreography, vocal coaching, and a punishing studio schedule. Michael, still a child, was absorbing lessons in performance and musicality from artists like Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross, essentially getting a masterclass most performers only dream of. The payoff was almost immediate: 4 consecutive #1 hits. But that success came at a cost, forcing Michael into an accelerated kind of adulthood most children never have to navigate. As the Jackson family's earnings grew, Joe Jackson purchased what became known as the Havenhurst estate in 1971. Michael later rebuilt much of the property into a custom Tudor-style mansion, complete with a home studio where he composed, experimented with bass lines, and recorded private demos. It's worth clarifying something here, though. The finished, chart-topping masters for albums like Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad weren't actually completed at Havenhurst. Those were polished by producer Quincy Jones and engineer Bruce Swedian at professional facilities, most notably Westlake Recording Studios in Los Angeles. Havenhurst was something different, a creative laboratory and a family home, complete with the now famous memory room where Michael kept mementos from his career. It remains standing today, still tied to the Jackson family estate, and recently served as a filming location for the biographical movie Michael. Westlake, where the sound was actually made. If Havenhurst was where ideas were born, Westlake Studio D was where they were perfected. This is where Jackson, Jones, and Swedian built the layered, meticulously engineered sound that defined an era of pop music. Michael reportedly recorded many of his vocal takes in near total darkness, moving and dancing as he sang so that the emotion of the performance would translate directly onto tape. The collaborative chemistry between Jackson and Swedian pushed studio technology and production techniques further than most engineers at the time thought possible. These weren't quick sessions. They were exercises in obsessive refinement, take after take, until every layer of sound sat exactly where Michael wanted it. Westlake, more than any mansion he ever owned, might be the single location most responsible for the sound the whole world came to recognize instantly. Neverland, building a fantasy from scratch. In 1987, Jackson purchased Sycamore Valley Ranch in Los Olivos, California, for somewhere between an estimated $17 and $30 million, and transformed it into the property the world would come to know as Neverland. This wasn't just a large home, it was a 2,700-acre attempt to recreate a childhood Jackson often said he felt he'd missed entirely. He installed a fully operational amusement park on the grounds, complete with a Ferris wheel, a roller coaster, a carousel, and bumper cars, all staffed by dedicated employees. There was a private zoo housing giraffes, orangutans, and his well-known chimpanzee companion, Bubbles. At the entrance stood an enormous floral clock, a detail that feels almost too poetic, given how much of Neverland seemed designed to let its owner freeze time and hold on to childhood just a little longer. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you had unlimited resources and wanted to build a physical escape from the entire world watching you, what would you build? Because that's essentially what Neverland was. a controlled environment engineered entirely around wonder, privacy, and Michael's own rules. The architecture of hiding across Neverland and his other residences, Jackson incorporated elaborate security measures, hidden passageways, panic rooms, and advanced surveillance systems that let him move through his own properties without being seen, even by staff or guests. It's one of the more striking paradoxes of his life. He was arguably the most photographed and scrutinized human being on the planet, and yet he built entire architectural systems specifically so he could disappear inside his own home. Life on the Move, Thriller Villa and Trump Tower. After Neverland's chapter closed, Jackson spent time at a rented Mediterranean-style property in Las Vegas that came to be nicknamed the Thriller Villa. At roughly 24,000 square feet, it included a private 74-seat chapel styled after medieval architecture, which Jackson reportedly used as a quiet space for reflection and watching films, away from media attention. During his time there, he lived an unusually isolated existence, rarely leaving except in disguise or under cover of darkness. Years earlier, in 1994, he'd also set up a working base inside Trump Tower in Manhattan, a 3,725-square-foot condominium on the 63rd floor, used primarily during production of his H.I. Story album. This wasn't a showcase home. It was functional space. He had an entire upstairs bedroom cleared of furniture and converted into a dance floor so he could rehearse choreography whenever inspiration struck, and access to the unit was tightly restricted through a key-locked elevator. Despite the building's marble and granite grandeur downstairs, visitors described his actual living space as minimal and almost stripped down, a rare moment of total anonymity in the middle of one of the busiest cities on Earth. Years of exile. After the 2005 trial, Jackson entered a genuinely uncertain period of his life, moving between countries including Bahrain and Ireland. Much of his once massive collection of assets was gradually sold off during this stretch, and he relied heavily on the hospitality of wealthy associates and foreign royalty to secure private, comfortable places to stay. These years functioned as a kind of prelude to his planned comeback tour, This Is It. He deliberately sought out remote and low-profile residences, attempting, not always successfully, to live somewhat like an ordinary person. One recurring, almost logistical headache throughout this period was simply transporting his enormous personal archive and belongings from place to place, a collection that remained central to his identity no matter how many times he had to relocate it. A life surrounded by objects. Jackson's fascination with art, antiques, and historical artifacts wasn't really about investment value. It was personal, almost narrative. He was drawn to items connected to figures who fascinated him, including Charlie Chaplin and the fictional world of Peter Pan. Ornate furniture, historical armor, and grand sculptures weren't just decoration in his eyes. They were pieces of a larger story he was constantly building around himself, a tangible blend of classical history and pop culture fantasy. Even his wardrobe functioned less like fashion and more like engineering. His famous single-glove, military-style jackets and glossy loafers were designed, in close partnership with costume designer Michael Bush, specifically to amplify his movement on stage, treated almost like a second skin, built to survive brutal, high-energy choreography night after night. His early years leaned formal. His later years leaned theatrical and increasingly experimental, but the underlying goal never changed. Make sure he stood out, even from the very back row of a stadium, separating the man from the headlines. Tabloids loved painting Jackson as a strange, detached figure living in a permanent fantasy world. But people who actually worked alongside him, engineers, producers, business partners, often described someone defined far more by discipline than eccentricity, grueling rehearsal schedules, demanding business meetings, and constant oversight of a sprawling financial empire. Strip away the sensational headlines, and what tends to emerge is a picture of someone obsessively committed to his craft, not a recluse drifting through an isolated fantasy. The final address. His last home was a leased estate at 100 North Carrollwood Drive in the Holmby Hills neighborhood, a large French chateau-style mansion he rented for around $100,000 a month, while preparing for the This Is It concert residency in London. 7 bedrooms, a private theater, expansive grounds. On paper, it looked like the peak of luxury. But this final chapter carried a darker undertone. His days became increasingly centered around medical treatment, including daily doses of propofol. The second-floor master suite, once presumably just another bedroom in a beautiful home, became filled with medical equipment, both a private refuge and, ultimately, the site of his final moments. Investigators later documented numerous prescription medications and IV equipment throughout the suite, a stark and sobering detail given everything that space represented just months earlier. What's left behind? So what happened to all of these places? Neverland, now back to its original name, Sycamore Valley Ranch, was purchased by businessman Ron Burkle in 2020 and has since been completely stripped of anything resembling its amusement park past. Havenhurst remains under the care of the Michael Jackson estate as something closer to a protected archive. Many of his other former residences have since been sold and heavily renovated, erasing most of the unusual security features he once considered essential to daily life. Taken together, these properties map an entire life, from a hopeful, overcrowded 2-bedroom house on Jackson Street to the guarded, fortress-like compounds of his final years. They stand today as physical evidence of just how complicated his legacy really is. Proof that even the most extraordinary fame in modern history was, in the end, just as temporary as the buildings that once held it. Which one of these places surprised you the most? The tiny childhood home, the amusement park hidden inside Neverland, or the quiet, almost invisible unit inside Trump Tower? Let me know in the comments, and if you'd like a deeper look into any one of these locations, say so. There's a lot more buried in each of these addresses than what made it into this video.